The morning ovens were still ticking with heat, and the air in the bakehouse smelled of yeast, smoke, and scorched honey when Magnus told Brigid she was past her prime. He stood there in a clean coat she hadn't seen before, while she had flour on her wrists and a streak of dough on her apron. "You smell like bread all the time," he said, like it was something shameful. "Like flour, like work, not like a woman a man still dreams about." Brigid didn't answer right away. She set the peel against the wall, slowly, careful not to let it clatter. Outside, the first cart rolled over the cobbles, and somebody laughed in the lane, not knowing a whole marriage was splitting open before sunrise. Magnus kept talking because silence made him brave. There was someone else, younger, lively, a woman named Celia, who understood what life could still be. He said it with that thin smile people wear when they want to sound honest and only manage cruel. Then he looked past Brigid, out toward the front of the village bakery, where the painted sign still carried his name. "I'm not leaving empty-handed," he said. "The shop goes with me. Everybody knows whose bakery this is." That was the moment something cold moved through her, something sharper than tears. Because Brigid had built the ovens with borrowed money, mixed every recipe by hand, and fed that place for years while Magnus smiled at the counter and let people believe what they liked. And when he reached into his coat and pulled out folded papers, she understood this had been planned for longer than one bad morning. If you want to stay with Brigid to the end, like the video and subscribe. After he said it, the room did not fall apart the way people imagine rooms do. The fire still breathed inside the brick. A tray of rolls still hissed where butter had slipped onto hot iron. Brigid stood there with those folded papers in Magnus's hand, and what hurt her most in that first minute was not even the younger woman. It was the lie that had been living in plain sight for years. When the bakery first opened, there had been no painted sign, no polished window, no proud name over the door. There had only been cold stone, a leaking roof, and Brigid with cracked knuckles, measuring flour by lamplight. She had chosen the first recipes. She had argued with masons about the shape of the ovens. She had stayed up through winter nights testing dough, then worked the counter by day until Magnus found he preferred smiling where people could see him. And slowly, the village did what villages do. It turned habit into truth. Magnus has a gift with business, people would say, while Brigid was in the back with heat on her face and ash on her sleeves. He never corrected them, not once. Now he laid the papers on the flour-dusted table between them. "Celia says there's no future in staying small," he said. "The place is worth something now. We sell, we move, we start fresh." Brigid looked down but didn't touch the papers. Her eyes went instead to the old accounts shelf by the wall, where a dented tin box still sat behind the ledgers. Because if Magnus had brought his papers today, she suddenly knew there were other papers he had hoped she would never think to find. She waited until Magnus went upstairs before she crossed to the shelf. The tin box was colder than she expected, and the lid gave a dry little scrape when she lifted it. Inside were old sugar invoices, a faded list of winter orders, 2 receipts for firewood, and empty space where a thicker bundle should have been. Brigid stood very still, one hand on the table, listening to the floorboards above her as Magnus moved through the bedroom they had shared for years, as if it were already a place he used to live. So he had looked before she did. He came down carrying a case and a coat over his arm. "Don't make this harder," he said, like kindness had anything to do with what he was doing. "Celia and I have been talking things through. There's a buyer in the city who knows what a place like this can become." Brigid turned, the old receipts still in her fingers. "A place like this," she said quietly, "or this place." He looked irritated now, not guilty. "You baked. I handled the rest. We both know that. That sentence landed harder than the one about flour, because it was not a sudden cruelty. It was a belief he had been living on for years. After he left, the bakery did what bakeries do. The front bell rang. The door opened. Cold air came in with the first customers, carrying damp wool and early fog. Brigid tied her apron tighter and served every loaf herself. But by noon, one thing would not leave her mind. If the papers were gone from the box, there might still be another place where the truth had been written down. By late afternoon, the rain had started. A thin, steady rain that tapped at the front glass and darkened the cobbles outside the village bakery. Brigid kept serving customers with the same calm hands, slicing paper, wrapping loaves, taking coins. But she noticed things she might once have let pass. The way Mrs. Fenner asked, too casually, "Is Magnus away today?" The way old Mr. Lyle looked toward the back room before saying, "Best crust in town, same as ever." People knew something. In a place like that, they always did. She closed an hour early to think, not to grieve, not yet. The bell gave one last tired ring behind the final customer, and then there was only the warm smell of baked apples, wet wool, and cooling iron. Brigid sat at the small table near the flour bins and pulled the old ledgers toward her one by one. Her handwriting filled them. Costs, timings, repairs, orders for feast days, notes on ovens running too hot in high summer. The whole life of the place was there, except the one thing that could matter most now. No ownership papers, no loan file, no title deed. At dusk, someone knocked on the side door. It was Irene Pike, the retired bookkeeper from 2 streets over, carrying a folded umbrella and the sharp look of a woman who counted more than money. She stepped inside, sniffed the air, and said, "I heard Magnus has been asking around about selling the building." Brigid said nothing. Irene studied her face for a moment, then lowered her voice. "If the papers are gone from here, there may still be a notary's record, and if there is, it'll tell the truth whether your husband likes it or not." The next morning, Brigid opened before dawn as she always did, though sleep had barely touched her. The dough felt cooler than usual under her palms, and the windows were still black when Irene came in through the side door with her umbrella dripping onto the flagstones. Neither woman wasted words. There are mornings when talk only gets in the way of what must be done. "I can mind the front for an hour," Irene said, tying off her scarf. "You need to go before Magnus does." Brigid looked toward the counter, toward the shelves she had stocked by hand, toward the sign outside carrying the wrong name. Then she nodded, untied her apron, and reached for her coat. The air outside bit at her cheeks. Rain from the night before still sat in the cracks between stones, and the whole street smelled of wet wood and coal smoke. The notary's office was at the far end of the square, above a narrow shop with faded blue shutters. Inside, it was dim and dry and smelled of paper, sealing wax, and old dust. A clerk with silver spectacles looked up when Brigid gave her name, then disappeared into a back room. She waited with both hands wrapped around her gloves, hearing the soft tick of a wall clock and the scratch of pages being moved somewhere out of sight. When the clerk returned, his voice had changed. "Mrs. Doyle," he said carefully, "there was an inquiry made yesterday by your husband." Brigid felt the floor steady under her feet. Then he added, "And he's due back this afternoon. If there's something you need found in the record, we should start now." Brigid did not sit. She followed the clerk through a narrow doorway into a records room where the air felt cooler, older, almost sealed away from the weather outside. Shelves climbed to the ceiling. Leather folders, tied bundles, thick ledgers with cracked spines. The kind of paper that keeps other people's secrets long after they stop speaking. "What year did the first loan go through?" the clerk asked. Brigid answered at once. She remembered that year by the ache in her hands, by the soot that got into everything, by the smell of wet plaster while the ovens were still being built. The clerk nodded and pulled out a ladder. Another woman came in from the front office to help, older than he was, with a neat gray braid and ink on her fingers. She glanced at Brigid, then at the note Magnus had left the day before. So, she said quietly, he came asking about a sale without bringing his wife. Brigid only said, I need to know what was filed. That seemed to be enough. They searched in silence for a while. Pages turned, boxes slid. Somewhere outside, a cart rattled over the square. Then the older woman reached high, tugged free a flat bundle wrapped in fading ribbon, and set it on the table between them with both hands as if it mattered. Dust lifted when she untied it. Inside were early permits, supplier forms, loan papers, and a folded document on heavier paper that the clerk touched with sudden care. He looked from the page to Brigid, then back again. Mrs. Doyle, he said, softer now, before your husband returns, I think you should read the name written on this for yourself. Brigid took the paper in both hands. It was thicker than the others, rough at the edges, with a seal pressed deep into the corner. For a second, the words would not settle. Her eyes moved over them once, then again, and there it was. Her name, tucked into no witness line, added nowhere later in some smaller place. Written plainly where ownership began. Brigid Doyle. The older clerk drew a slow breath. This is the first registration, she said. The baking license, too. She turned another page, then another. And this is the loan filing for the ovens. The security was attached through property brought in under your name. Brigid's fingers tightened on the page. She remembered that loan. She remembered signing after midnight because flour dust was still in her hair. And the lender had said they needed one name that could stand behind the debt. Magnus had been there, talking, nodding, taking up space. But the pen had been in her hand. The younger woman had not stolen the bakery. Magnus had never owned it the way he claimed he did. That truth did not arrive like triumph. It arrived like a room being lit after years of working in the dim. Can you make copies? Brigid asked. We can certify them, the clerk said, at once. He had barely finished speaking when the bell out in the front office rang. Voices followed. A man's voice first, easy and certain. Then a woman's, lighter, impatient, unfamiliar, but already too comfortable. Magnus had come back. And from the sound of her heels on the floorboards, Celia had come with him. No one in that records room rushed, and that made the moment sharper. The older clerk folded the top page back into place just as Magnus's voice carried in from the front office. Smooth, confident, already half laughing. Celia said something lower, quicker, the kind of voice that expected doors to open. Brigid slipped her hands from the document, but not before she felt the raised seal once more under her thumb. It was real. Paper. Ink. Her name. Put the originals away, she said. The clerk nodded at once. We'll bring out only the certified copies. By the time Magnus stepped into the doorway, Brigid was standing beside the desk with her coat buttoned, calm as stone. Celia came in just behind him, younger by years and dressed like she was already leaving for somewhere brighter. Her eyes moved around the room fast, taking in shelves, ledgers, the clerks, Brigid. Not ashamed, just impatient. Magnus smiled first at the staff, then at Brigid, as if this were all a small delay in a day that belonged to him. There you are, he said. I thought I might find you here, making this more complicated than it needs to be. Brigid said nothing. He turned to the clerk. I'm here about the bakery property. We need to move quickly if there's going to be a sale. The younger clerk opened his mouth, but the older woman spoke first. Which property do you mean, Mr. Doyle? Magnus gave a short laugh. My bakery! The room went still. Then the clerk drew the first certified page toward him, adjusted his spectacles, and began to read the owner's name aloud. The clerk read it cleanly, without drama, which made it hit even harder. Registered owner and licensed operator, Brigid Doyle. For a beat, nobody moved. You could hear the faint rasp of paper under the clerk's hand, the rain ticking at the front window, Celia's bracelet giving one small click as her arm dropped to her side. Magnus stared as if the words might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. That's not possible, he said at last. There's some mistake. The older clerk slid over the next sheet. There is no mistake, Mr. Doyle. The first loan, the baking license, and the property registration were all filed under your wife's name. She did not sound pleased or cruel, only certain. Celia turned to him then, with calculation. You told me it was yours, she said, very low. Magnus kept his eyes on the papers. It is mine, in every way that matters. Brigid heard that, and something inside her went still in a new way. He was standing in front of ink, seals, signatures, years of proof, and still choosing the story that made him larger. That was the measure of him. She picked up the certified copies and tucked them into her bag. Magnus finally looked at her. Brigid, don't be stubborn. We can sort this out privately. She met his face for only a second. It was sorted out the day I signed. Then she thanked the clerks and walked past him. Behind her, Celia asked one question that stopped even Magnus from speaking right away. If it's hers, she said, then what exactly were you planning to sell? She did not go straight home. Brigid stepped out of the notary's office into air that smelled of rain, chimney smoke, and damp stone, and stood for a moment beneath the awning with the papers safe in her bag. Across the square, Magnus and Celia were still inside, their voices muffled now, no longer smooth. She did not turn back to listen. Some truths do their work without an audience. Instead, she crossed toward the paint and hardware shop. The bell above that door gave a thin metal jingle, and old Mr. Varden looked up from a stack of brushes. Morning, Brigid, he said. Then he noticed her face and did not ask foolish questions. What do you need? White paint, she said, and a smaller tin of deep blue. Good brushes, too. He blinked once, then nodded as if he understood more than she had said. And before we go one step further, tell me where you're listening from today. Leave your town or your part of the world below. And if you've ever had to stand quietly while truth caught up with a lie, write this in the comments. What is mine will remain with me. Brigid carried the wrapped tins back through the square herself. By then, word had already started to travel ahead of her in that quick, invisible way village news travels. Two women paused mid-conversation when she passed. A delivery boy glanced from her bag to the bakery sign across the street. When she reached the door, Irene was waiting inside by the counter, flour on her sleeve, worry in her eyes. Well? She asked. Brigid set the paint on the table, touched the papers in her bag, and looked up at the name over the window. Help me close early, she said. That sign is coming down today. They closed before sunset. That alone was enough to pull eyes toward the window. In a place like that, people noticed when bread ran out early, when curtains were drawn before the lamps were lit, when a woman who had opened in darkness all her life suddenly locked the door while the street was still awake. Irene flipped the sign to closed. Brigid untied her apron, rolled up her sleeves, and stood beneath the board that had carried Magnus's name for far too long. The screws were stiff with age. Mr. Varden came over without being asked, carrying a ladder that smelled of old pine and varnish. Hold this steady, he murmured, more to the moment than to anyone. A pair of boys stopped across the road. Mrs. Fenner pretended to adjust the basket on her arm while watching every second of it. No one made a scene. That was not Brigid's way, and somehow the village understood. When the sign finally came loose, it gave with a dry wooden groan. Brigid took one end, Mr. Varden the other, and together they lowered it to the floor inside the shop. Under the frame, the original wood of the frontage was paler, protected from years of rain and smoke. It looked almost like a scar that had been covered too long. Irene opened the white paint. The sharp smell filled the room. Brigid dipped the brush and drew the first clean stroke over the old lettering without a tremor in her hand. Outside, the murmurs grew softer, then stopped altogether when someone at the door said, very low, "Magnus is coming back, and he doesn't look alone." The brush paused in Brigid's hand, but only for a breath. She did not turn right away. The shop smelled of fresh paint, warm flour, and the last batch of bread cooling on the racks. Outside, shoes scraped on the stone step. Inside, Irene set the lid back on the paint tin with a soft click and moved closer, not to shield Brigid, only to stand beside her. When Magnus pushed the door open, the little bell gave one thin note and then fell silent. He stopped just inside. Celia was behind him, wrapped in a coat too fine for a room that still held heat from baking. Her eyes went first to the sign lying on the floor, then to the blue paint, then to Brigid. Whatever picture Magnus had painted for her before, it had not included this. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked. Brigid laid the brush across the tin and faced him fully. "Working," she said. His jaw tightened. "You can't change the front without speaking to me." At that, a murmur moved through the people gathered outside the glass. They had edged closer without meaning to. Mr. Varden still held the ladder. Mrs. Fenner stood under her umbrella as if she had forgotten to go home. Brigid reached into her bag and took out the certified pages. She did not wave them. She did not need to. She simply placed them on the counter between the bread knife and the cash tray. Celia stepped nearer before Magnus did. Her face changed as she read the first line. Then she looked at him, not angry now, but embarrassed for having believed him. "So this whole time," she said quietly, "the only thing you really had was her work." And Magnus, red with the first real shame of his life, reached for the papers. His hand stopped halfway. Brigid didn't flinch. Irene didn't move between them either. It stopped because the whole room had gone so quiet that even Magnus seemed to hear himself for the first time. The cooling racks ticked softly in the back. Rain tapped at the window. Somewhere outside, someone shifted their weight on the wet stones. Brigid laid her palm over the papers before he could touch them. "You've taken enough with your voice," she said, calm and low. "You don't take these." Celia stepped back as if the air in the room had changed shape. Her face had lost that bright, eager look she brought with her. Now she saw the flour on the shelves, the old wood, the oven's heat still trapped in the walls. And she understood this was never some clever little prize waiting to be claimed. It was a life, built slowly, by hands that were not Magnus's. He tried once more to gather himself. "This doesn't have to become a public humiliation." At that, Mrs. Fenner spoke from the doorway before anyone invited her to. "It became public when you started calling her work your own." A few people murmured then, just enough. Magnus looked toward the window, toward the faces outside, and something in him faltered. The crowd was not angry in the way he expected. That might have been easier. They were simply seeing clearly. Brigid picked up the brush again. With one steady stroke, she covered the last letters of his name on the old board. Then, in blue over the fresh white paint, she began writing the first letter of the new one. Just as the bakery bell rang again, and a voice from the threshold called out that tomorrow's orders had doubled overnight. By dawn, the new name was dry enough to hang. The rain had passed in the night, and the air outside the shop smelled washed clean. Wet wood, chimney ash, and the first warm pull of bread from the ovens. Mr. Varden fixed the board in place while Irene held the ladder and Brigid stood below with flour on her hands and blue paint still caught under one thumbnail. When the shutters opened, people were already waiting. They came because word had run faster than sleep. They came because the truth had finally caught up with the smell they had followed for years. And when the first trays came out, the line bent past the window, then farther still. By midday, the bread was gone, and by evening, there were more orders than Brigid had taken on any ordinary market week. Magnus did not come back inside. Celia left before noon, carrying nothing that belonged to the place. He remained across the street once, just once, long enough to see that a borrowed name can fade in a single night, but the hands that built the fire do not. Some things never needed rescuing. They only needed the soot wiped off the brass so they could shine under their own light. That evening, after the last loaf was wrapped, Brigid pinned one certified copy inside the cupboard by the flour sacks, not for display, only as a quiet witness. Then she set the next day's dough and smiled when it rose. If this story stayed with you, write below. The bread remembers. And if you want more stories like this, stay close.